All right. Let's see who is all here. Mark. Hi. Cameron. Hi. Vanna. Daisy. Andrew. Katerina.
Here.
Zani. Calvin. Lillian. Kaiwan. Yolanda. Emma. Valentina. Axel. Marco. Miriam.
You said Miriam.
Miriam? Yeah. Verena. Stephanie. Gia. Che. Eunice. And she. All right, so.
Valentina, I think I'm so sorry.
No, it's okay. Got you. Great.
Valentina.
Yeah, I think I was calling your name when you just came in,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. Great. All right. So,
Didn't mention my name.
what's your name?
Honey.
Okay, are you on Canvas? Let's see. What's your last name?
Can I do this? A-L-A-I-D-A-R-E-S.
So, do you have access to Canvas? To the Canvas course? I guess I should ask, are you registered?
I think so, yeah.
Okay, all right. As long as you have access. Good. All right, I'm not sure where you're not showing up. Okay. All right, so volunteers for next week, perhaps. Again, what we're asking for is for people to post bullet point notes, questions, observations, passages you'd like us to focus on from the reading. The topic for next week is sublime forces. That's the sublime, and also genius. Genius will be on our agenda for the middle part of Kant's Critique of Judgement. Any volunteers for next time? Two presenters for next time? Sufficiently intimidated by the reading this week? Is that what happened? Okay. That's one. Can I get another? Anybody? What's happening next week that no one can volunteer? Zani, you want to do the sublime and genius. I can tell. You definitely do want to. Okay, so you guys, excellent. Thank you. All right. Yeah, so the pages for next week are 101 to 228, so a little bit longer selections next time than this time, a bit over 100 pages, but the reading gets easier. As I mentioned, the reading does get easier because the preface and the introduction were probably the densest of the reading that we'll be doing from the Critique of Judgement, because he's sort of running through his whole philosophy and, being very condensed about it. Whereas when he gets more discursive in the body of the book, then it's easier to read, easier prose. Although I did mention that the prose is going to be a little bit formidable. By the time you get used to it, we'll be moving on to the next author, Schiller. And Schiller is just very discursive, so it's not going to be the same problem whatsoever. But Kant is one of our more difficult readings for the entire semester. So just keep that in mind. Yeah.
Chris, I just got mixed up a moment ago with the bullet points
Yeah.
canvas.
Uh-huh.
I thought we all had to do that. Is that just the people who are assigned for that week?
Everyone is encouraged but not required, and the presenters are required.
I see. Okay.
Yes. So you did submit this week, yes?
I submitted it.
Yeah, and that was great. Excellent. So, yeah.
And one more question, I can't see week 3 in the files. I was looking for it yesterday.
Because there's only one for us. Hold on. There's only the critique of judgment for week 2, 3, and 4. So I think those folders might be empty. Hold on. Let me see. Let me see if that's the case. Those folders might be empty. Oh no, there was no week 3. That's right. There's week 4. Oh, only because I've got some silly little performance art thing from Laurie Anderson for week 4. Otherwise, the readings are the same for week 3 as for week 2. That's why there's no folder. Sorry for the confusion with that. Okay, so I want to remind us from last week, to begin with, the real subject of, certainly of Kant's Critique of Judgement, but also of the entire course, everything that we'll be reading in the course. So what is the subject? Freedom. Freedom. Philosophy of freedom, and how freedom particularly manifests in the realm of the aesthetic judgment, aesthetic form, aesthetic feeling, aesthetic subjectivity, or as Herbert Marcuse wrote a book on it, the aesthetic dimension of our subjectivity. Because actually the aesthetic is always at work, always functioning. It's always part of our subjectivity at all times. So freedom is our topic for the entire course. Certainly it is for Kant's Critique of Judgment. But freedom understood in a specific way, in a modern way, that's perhaps fallen out of cognizance. Most people are not aware of the modern concept of freedom. They're aware of the ancient concept of freedom, the freedom to be, but less aware of the modern concept of freedom, which is the freedom to become, the freedom to change, the freedom to transform. Freedom in transformation. And that's really the issue. Okay. So, that said, Kant runs through his entire philosophy up to this point because this is the third critique. So he wrote 2 prior critiques. And this is meant to be the capstone, the crowning achievement of the entire Kantian system of philosophy. So this is meant to culminate Kant's entire critical philosophy. Okay, so let's talk about that. The critical turn in Kant is the turn that he made when he read Jean-Jacques Rousseau and was so impressed by it and sort of shaken by it that he took 10 years of publication silence before he was able to formulate his critical philosophy. And he did so in the form of 3 critiques. So critique, we talked last week about the critical. You know, we read Hamza Walker, Susan Buckmorse, Robert Pippin on the critical in critical theory. What's meant by critical? So critical is about change. It's about the possibility for change. So where does this idea come from? Where did Susan Buckmorse and Robert Pippin get their notion of the critical from? From Kant. From Kant. So critique. Critique does not mean criticism. It doesn't mean like a debunking or a deconstruction or a takedown or an opposition. It doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean poking holes in the logic of. That's not what critique means. Here, in what we're dealing with, Kant's use of the term critique. Kant's meaning, right? So one of the things that we're doing, the exercise in reading that we're going to have to do with all of the writings we're reviewing in the course, is we're going to have to pay attention to how not only a specific author uses terms, uses concepts and categories in their writing, but also any particular writing. How are the major concepts and categories being defined in that piece of writing? And it will come out in the argument, how the terms are being used, how they're being defined, and usually it's not going to be our colloquial connotation. It's not going to be our received common usage of the term. So you can't read your prior meaning of the term into the term when you're reading it in a serious philosophical work. You have to allow the writer to define the term, because they're usually defining it in a new and different way. Otherwise, there would be no point in them writing what they wrote. Right? People don't write, serious people don't write just to do chatter, just to contribute to the discourse. No. It's to say something new and different that's worth saying. Otherwise, why bother? Right? So we're dealing with serious thinkers, serious writers, serious philosophy, new and different use of concepts and categories. Not received meanings. No. Not received understandings. No. Okay. So critique, we had a little bit of this language in the Pippin last week. Critique means exploring conditions of possibility for change. So if we recall the freedom and transformation, the dialectic of being and becoming, critique is about the possibility of change, the possibility of becoming, the possibility of a self-overcoming. Critique is about the ought. It's about what could be and should be but isn't yet. It's about the actuality of things. The truth of something is not merely as it exists, but as it might become new and different from what it already is. So the truth of something is not merely as it exists. It's as it might change, and as it might realize an inherent potential. That is the truth of something. And the truth of something often contradicts what it is in its mere existence. Right, so this is a peculiar way of thinking, a peculiar way of talking about things. This is dialectics. The modern dialectic, it's dialectics. So, for instance, Hegel. We'll get to Hegel eventually. The truth of society is the state. Why? Because the state contradicts society. Meaning, you're having a block party and the police show up. The state is the truth of society? No. Well, the truth is the contradiction. Right? It's that contradiction that reveals the truth. So the block party didn't know that it needed the police until the police showed up, and then did they need the police, or did the state need to change so that they don't come and crack heads every time there's a block party? Right? So it's that antagonistic back and forth interplay contradiction between things in which the truth is revealed. That's Hegel. We'll get to Hegel. But change, as long as we know, critique is about possibility for change. Now, what Kant set out to do, writing 3 critiques, why did he have to write 3 critiques? Because he chose to address the faculties, the essential faculties of the subject, in terms of the ancient categories, the ancient virtues of the true, the good, and the beautiful. Right, so ancient philosophy, going all the way back to classical antiquity, was concerned with the nature and character, the substance and appearance, the essence and the phenomena of the true, the good, and the beautiful. So how do we know what's true? How do we know what's good? How do we know what is beautiful? This is what philosophers have been talking about for thousands of years. So if you remember from Pippin last time, Pippin said that starting with Kant, it's not about the world or things in themselves, but it's about our subjective faculties. Right? So no thing is true or good or beautiful, but rather it's in our subjectivity of it, it's in our apprehension of it, it's in our knowledge of it that things are true, good, and beautiful. Things in themselves are not true, good, or beautiful. The world is not true, good, or beautiful in itself. Right? These are subjective categories. They're not objective categories. Now, true, good, and beautiful, Western philosophy, I suppose we could say, going back to ancient Greece, to Plato, Aristotle, before Plato and Aristotle, pre-Socratic philosophy, the true, the good, and the beautiful. So what makes these categories possible as subjective phenomena? As subjective phenomena. So again, Pippin from last week said we need Kant on appearance. We need Kant on appearance. Meaning, what is the meaning of the way things appear to us? What's the meaning of phenomena? Right, so if phenomena are subjective, nonetheless, they're real. They have substance. Even if the substance is not in the thing itself, the substance is in us. Nonetheless, they have substance. So what makes it possible for us to grasp, experience, for things to appear to us as true, good, or beautiful? But more importantly, what makes it possible for us to change what we regard as true, what we regard as good, and what we regard as beautiful? So Kant, he's coming at the end of the Enlightenment. He has a universalistic cosmopolitan view. So he's inspired by Jean-Jacques Rousseau and other Enlightenment philosophers. All cultures at all times and all places, all human communities that are not natural communities, in other words, insofar as humans are not animals, but are human, which pretty much is everything after 200,000 years ago when humans invented language, art, religion, culture, morality. The zoon politikon, Aristotle's concept, the zoon politikon, humans are the political animal, so we're not merely the social animal. There are many species of social animals. We are also a social animal species, but we are, unlike the other social animal species, political. What does that mean? It means that we create an artificial community. We create culture. We don't live in a natural community, but we live in a cultural community, which is an artificial community, something that we create and something that we can change. So all peoples, always, all times, all places, have had notions of the true, the good, and the beautiful. But the substance of the true, the good, and the beautiful varies across time and space between communities. It varies radically within Western culture, if there's such a thing as Western culture, Western civilization. It's kind of a weird 19th century construct. But anyway, leaving that aside, everyone has had notions of the true, the good, and the beautiful, but what that has meant, how it appeared to people, was different, and therefore what the substance of it, of these categories, was different. So the truth of the true is that it changes. The truth of the good is that it changes. The truth of the beautiful is that it changes. Right, so we're not dealing with our biological sense perception. So human beings are the same species for hundreds of thousands of years. Biologically, we're the same. Culturally, we're different. Our eyes, our ears, our brains are the same. But our subjective experience is different. How do we account for that? Our freedom. Meaning we change the truth. We change the morally good. We change the beautiful. For the ancients, by contrast, in their notion of freedom to be, they take the true, the good, and the beautiful to be eternal categories. In other words, unchanging. Meaning what is true has always been true and always will be true. What is good has always been good, will always be good. What is beautiful has always been beautiful, will always be beautiful. Modern people know that that's not true. Because the experience of, for Kant's time, the previous 300 years or so, had shown just how radically different and alterable these things can be. In the 1700s, they know that what they think is true is not what people in the past thought was true. And they knew that in the future, people will have a different truth than they had then. They know that what was moral for them was not always moral in the past and will not always be moral in the future. The morality is constantly evolving. Similarly, what we regard as aesthetically pleasing, as beautiful, changes. Medieval paintings are not beautiful in the way that Renaissance paintings are. The statues of ancient Egypt are not beautiful the way the statues of ancient Greece are. There's difference. Yet clearly, the cultures all found them to be aesthetically pleasing. And yet formally they were quite different. They appeared quite different. Sensuously different. Okay, so whereas for the ancients, the true, the good, and the beautiful are about an eternal substance of things that doesn't change. For moderns, it's understood that these are functions of our faculties, phenomena of our faculties, and our faculties do change. All right, so his first critique was concerned with the truth, or what he calls the understanding, meaning how and why do we find concepts or theories true? How do we use our faculty of understanding such that we find concepts, theories to be true? What makes that possible? What makes it possible for us to have a true concept of things, a true theory of things, and to change our concepts and our theories in pursuit of the truth? The second critique is about what he calls reason. And he says that reason is concerned with practice, it's concerned with morality, it's concerned with desire. So how and why do we practically want, desire, and attain the good in practice? So you'll see between the first and second critique, we have a dialectic of theory and practice. A dialectic of theory and practice. What's the relationship between practical morality and true concepts, true theory, true understandings of things? Now, he wrote it in the order of first critique, the faculty of understanding, second critique, practical reason. He actually thought that practical reason is prior to the understanding. So practical reason is prior to, practice is prior to theory in Kant's view. Now, why is that? It's because in our theory, in our understanding, in our concepts, we're concerned with nature. We're concerned with what is. We're concerned with grasping what is. And the necessity of what is. The necessity of what exists. Whereas it's in our practical faculties that we exercise our freedom. So a dialectic of theory and practice is also a dialectic of freedom and necessity. Why? Because we change our necessities. Meaning we have physical and biological necessities as an animal species. But how we meet those physical and biological necessities changes across history. And not only that, we produce new needs for ourselves, new necessities that we didn't have as an animal species. So we change the realm of necessity through our freedom. We transform it. There's continuity and change. There's continuity, we're still the same animal species we always were, but there's change. There's a transformation of our natural necessity that we achieve through our freedom. Right. As an animal species, there's absolutely no necessity whatsoever to have a seminar on philosophy. Zero. Right? As a primate species, we have no need for philosophy at all. None. We barely have need of language as an animal species. Not language the way we have it, that's for sure. The animals don't need it. But we have it. It's a necessity now. We can't back out of it. Right, we've created new needs for ourselves in practice. We've created new practical needs for ourselves. And that's our freedom. That's another Rousseau business. So Rousseau thought it was through the exercise of our reason in freedom that we actually create unfreedom for ourselves. Man is born free, but everywhere is in chains. And then what do? We break the chains. So in our freedom, we create chains for ourselves, and then in our freedom, we burst the chains. And then it turns out we burst the old chains, we produce new chains, and on and on and on. Right. So we're historical. We have a history as a species in a way that natural species don't. Natural species don't have histories. They're the same for millions of years. The bees are the same. They create the same beehives for millions of years. Humans did not always need or live or function, work in air-conditioned skyscrapers. No. No, we didn't always have this. Absolutely not. But now we need it. We do. We need fucking air conditioning. I'm sweating here, motherfuckers. There's a note on the wall. No, that's not good enough. Fix it, SAIC. All right, I need air conditioning. If it was 300,000 years ago, I would not, but it's 2025, I need air conditioning. Practice. That's the practical realm. Now, how is the third critique, the critique of judgment, the culmination of Kant's philosophy? Because in some ways he thought that he had already done his philosophy with the first two critiques. And then he realized, oh, actually, yeah, I have to do a third critique. So definitely true, the good and the beautiful, but he addressed the beautiful along the way in the other critiques and also in other writings. And then he realized, actually, we have to pay attention to that. So how's that? So we change how we do things before we have a theory or an understanding or a concept of what we've done. So we alter things in the practical realm before we understand. So practice comes before theory. In that respect, our practices are not reducible to our concepts of them. So practice always exceeds theory. Practical reason exceeds our understanding, our concepts and our theories. Similarly, our experience of the beautiful is not reducible to our concept of the beautiful. It's not reducible to our understanding of the beautiful. It's not reducible to our theory of the beautiful. Also, we can experience things as pleasant and beautiful that are not practically good for us or not practically useful. So the beautiful is also not reducible to practical goodness. We can experience things that are beautiful that are of no practical use. We can have satisfaction aesthetically that is not a practical satisfaction, that is not a practical gratification. Because why? Why should we ever feel good about something that isn't practically good for us? How bizarre is that? But again, how? Why? Because we're free, meaning our faculties exceed our practical necessities. We have capacities that go beyond how we do things now, how we are now, what is the case now. And the beautiful is the clearest demonstration of that. Practical is also a demonstration of that. We can do things that we don't have a concept for, but also we can experience things as pleasant and as satisfying without it being a practical satisfaction. So the beautiful exceeds both the practical and the theoretical. Now, these are analytic distinctions that Kant's making. These are not actually different things. They are aspects of the same thing. So our subjectivity is one thing. He calls it one cognitive process, one cognition, one subjectivity. These things are only distinguished analytically. In reality, when we have a true understanding of something, we feel it to be the case, meaning when our concept of something is true, it gives us a pleasant feeling. We get an aesthetic satisfaction out of a true concept. A false concept, by contrast, causes us pain, even though it's not causing us any practical pain, it causes us mental pain. When people are using concepts falsely, it hurts. When you hear people talking nonsense, it's painful. Why is that? Why? So the beautiful, the aesthetic, is actually part of the understanding and reason. Right. So even though the practical comes before the theoretical, we never practice without a theory, nor do we ever have a theory completely divorced from the practical realm. So these things are always bound up. They're only analytically distinct. They're not actually different things. There's one subjectivity. There's one fundamental condition, freedom. And then there are these analytical distinctions regarding our subjectivity. So it makes sense to some extent, or he thinks so, he's offering through his philosophy. Does it help us make sense to analyze it this way, to break it down this way? Again, he's taking a cue from the ancients, saying, well, we have analytically distinguished these things for thousands of years, so there's probably something to that. So let's see what we've been talking about for thousands of years, but now finally realize what it's really all about and what it really means. I think that I mentioned that Hegel has a funny way of putting it, which is that Kant invented philosophy, and then Hegel completed it. And the reason that Hegel completed it is that we're all philosophers now. I don't know if I mentioned this last week. If I didn't, I'll mention it now. I mentioned Kant was influenced by Rousseau. What he said was, Rousseau taught him that even though he was a specialized, trained, educated philosopher, an educated philosopher, that he had no right to think of himself as more intelligent than a common day laborer, and that philosophy is just about what everyone already knows. So philosophy is just a kind of technical analytic breakdown of common sense. So everybody already knows everything. You don't need to read Kant. You already know it. But if you want to get into a fine-grained analysis of how it works at a more technical level, and especially if you want to be clear with your use of concepts, then this might be helpful. But otherwise, we already know it. right? So it's different from the ancients. It's different from Plato and Aristotle, who thought only some people can know certain things. They have to be educated, they have to have enough leisure time to think, otherwise they are just going to be ignorant of it. That's not what we're dealing with in this course. What we're dealing with in this course is a humanistic, egalitarian, democratic notion of subjectivity, meaning everybody has it. Aristotle, by contrast, thought there are some people who are only fit to work. They're called slaves, and they are just tools. They are tools that can speak. They can't be anything but that because they don't have the time, the energy, the leisure, the benefit of education to be anything other than what they are, slaves. That's not what we're dealing with in this course in terms of modernism. The idea here is that all humans, qua human, can and should be free and exercise their faculties of freedom. That's something that we have to deal with up front. That's got to be clear. All right, so judgment, the beautiful, it's about feelings. It's about when we accomplish something practical in a good way, it feels good. When we have a true understanding, it feels good. It's about that kind of mental satisfaction, the aesthetic feeling, which he thought actually adjudicates, it mediates, it judges this dialectic of theory and practice. So in the interplay of our faculties and the interplay of our understanding and our practical reason, how do we adjudicate the exercise of these faculties? We do so guided by feelings of pleasure and pain. Pleasure guides us, and pain forbids us. Right, so pain, when we experience pain, we know we're doing something wrong. When we experience pleasure, we know we're doing something right. In the way he's using pleasure and pain. We're going to see it's a little bit more complicated next week when we get into sublime. The sublime is painful, but then it's the pleasure of pain. Right, so it's the pleasure of the experience of pain that isn't an overwhelming feeling of pain, but is a manageable feeling of pain. The sublime. So we're going to complicate things next time, but this time sticking with pleasure. So when we use our faculty of judgment, we are mediating theory and practice. We're guided by feeling. And that this is the feeling that attaches to a sense of freedom. Meaning freedom feels good, unfreedom feels painful. The free exercise of our faculties feel good. The unfree condition of our faculties causes us pain. So the things he talks about in the introduction, there are two sets of concepts of nature and concepts of freedom, concepts of necessity and concepts of freedom. Concepts of what is and concepts of what ought to be. Concepts of being and concepts of becoming. So when we use concepts, we use two different kinds of concepts. One to describe things as they are, to grasp things as they are, and one to describe and grasp how we might change them. Concepts of nature, concepts of freedom. In that, again, first critique, understanding, is about what is. Second critique, reason, about what could be. And then how do we adjudicate this process of becoming out of the state of being, guided by feelings, use of our aesthetic judgment. Now I mentioned that last time I mentioned that this week we'll be dealing with beautiful objects. Next week we'll be dealing with sublime forces, and then in the third week of Kant we'll be dealing with the combination of beautiful objects and sublime forces, namely teleological beings. So, which are a combination of beautiful objects and sublime forces. He is trying to realize things that he brought up in the first two critiques, like, again, culminating his philosophy. And one of the things that he's arguing against is a mechanical view of the universe and a mechanical view of ourselves. So a mechanical view of nature and a mechanical view of freedom. So why does this matter? Because he's trying to develop a more organic view of both nature and of ourselves. Whereas up to that point, philosophers were struggling with the ghost in the machine problem, which is that clearly animals and humans are machines, but then doesn't seem like we're just machines. Seems like there's something else going on, and so we seem to be machines possessed by ghosts, right? So there's like a ghost in the machine, and he's like, yeah, that's not a good way of thinking about things. No, that's not. It's not a good view of living things, life, neither animal life nor human life. So one of his desiderata here in the Critique of Judgement is how to overcome a kind of mechanistic and deterministic view of both nature and ourselves. Why? Because can't explain freedom. So if freedom is not going to be some extrinsic thing that comes from who knows where, the ghost in the machine, it needs a better account. Now, his philosophy is prompted by debates in the 1700s and preceding in the 1600s. So there's Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, Newton. There's David Hume. There's John Locke. There's David Hume in particular. So Hume has this notion, empiricism, empirical philosophy, which is that all knowledge is based on sense data perception. All knowledge is based on extrapolations from what we observe with our senses. And therefore, any other notions that we have, other than those that are derived from our sense data perception, are just fictions. They're more or less useful fictions. So theories, concepts, or understanding is a fiction that in itself has no substance, has no intrinsic truth. This is Humean skepticism. So skepticism for Hume is with regards to our theories, to our understanding, our concepts. The idea is that our theories, our concepts, our understanding has to do with metaphysical objects that don't really exist. And therefore are fictional, and we can maintain our skepticism about them. They're more or less useful as fictions, but they have no substance in themselves. Kant, by contrast, thinks, well, actually, they do have a substance. Our concepts, our theories, our understanding do have a substance, but it's not a substance as traditionally understood. So traditional metaphysics is misleading. So he needs a new basis for metaphysics. Metaphysics is not a function of the world or things in themselves. It's a function of our faculties. So metaphysical objects have their substance in our faculties. So our theory, our understanding, our concepts do have a substance, but they refer to our subjective faculties. That's the substance. So in that respect, our metaphysical categories, our metaphysical concepts, our metaphysical theories have an a priori character, meaning none of us go into any sense data perception of anything, completely innocent of any prior notions, ideas. We don't go into it just as a tabula rasa, as a blank slate. We're not just robots with sense data collection devices, just absorbing sense data. No. There is something prior to any experience, and that he refers to as the a priori character of our subjectivity. And he also calls that our transcendental subjectivity, or the transcendental subject. So what's meant by that? What's meant by it is that so sense data perception, at any given point in space and time, we have a perception of things. The question is, what is continuous and unites all those moments of sense data perception in space and time? What transcends any given moment in space and time? So our perception varies considerably based on circumstance. So our subjectivity can't be, if our subjectivity has any substance in itself, if we're not just going from one impression of things to another impression of things, then it is in a unity of apperception. He calls the unity of apperception. So our subjectivity is unified, finds its coherence, is held together, not by perception, but by apperception. And apperception is our perception of our perception, meaning our awareness of our perception. So we don't just have a naive perception of things, but we're always perceiving our perception of things, apperception. So it's in our faculties of apperception. It's in our apperceptive faculties. It's in our ability to perceive our own perceptions that our subjectivity is unified and transcends any given moment in space and time of sense data perception. What that allows for is understanding how our senses can be educated. So our sense data perception can be developed, can be educated, can change. So we're born with eyes, ears, nerves, brains, but we can educate ourselves to be able to perceive things differently. So that's, again, the unity of apperception. It's what transcends in our subjectivity, any moment in space and time. Yeah, this thing is dead. Sorry. So experience has a substance. Experience is not just accumulation of data. It's not just quantity of data. There's a qualitative transformation that's involved in our education, in the development of our faculties. So by the way, now that we're in the large language models and artificial intelligence and all this stuff, right? Like, no? I'm very skeptical. Why? Because we're trying to teach machines how to be human, but we're teaching machines how to be human based on our understanding of the human, which is pretty impoverished. Meaning, Kant's arguing against everything that's going on in this domain right now. Why? Because we're not just pattern recognition devices. We're not just pattern recognition devices that are educated through the accumulation of more patterns to recognize. No. We're going to get into it today. So our experience of something as beautiful is not reducible to our concept of the beautiful, which also means it's not reducible to our prior experience of the beautiful. So it's not something like this has made me feel this way before. No, that's easy to explain. That's just conditioning. That's almost like a behavioral response. Right, so LLMs and artificial intelligence are basically based on behavioral psychology, which is a pretty impoverished notion. It's like a dog saliva view of intelligence. Do you know about Pavlov's dog, right? You ring the bell and show the food, and then you don't show the food, you just ring the bell, the dog salivates. Yeah, no. That's also a poor representation of the dog, let alone the human. Dogs are more free than that, actually. And humans, of course, are quite more free than that. So what we have is like machines trained to be idiots. In other words, based on a kind of idiotic notion of the human, we're training machines to be like replications of idiocy, and we're going to call that intelligence. No. Why? Because freedom is missing. Machines will never be free, because the machines are just us. They're just tools that we've created. They'll never be free. They won't have subjectivity. All right, so this is my basic introduction, and we can get into the more details of what we read for today. But this is just to orient us, what he tries to pack into the preface and the introduction in terms of how he's proceeding with the critique of judgment now. I talked about feeling, I didn't mention imagination. So imagination. So let's talk about that, because that's going to be important. So imagination means that the image that we have in our mind of something is, again, not reducible to our sense data perception of it. So what something is mentally is not the same as it is perceptually. Now this will be important when we move on to Schiller and Hegel, because if humans have been the same biologically for thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, because they have, physically, biologically, we're the same species. What has changed? Our subjectivity. One of the ways that we can grasp that is how we imagine things has changed. How we imagine the world has changed. How we imagine space and time have changed. So for instance, in the realm of art, the art works, like visual art, painting and sculpture, does not present the world as our eyes, our sense data perceptive faculties perceive it, but as our minds imagine it. So the reason that art can be so different across different cultures and across history is because of changes in our imagination. So how we imagine the world to be, that's where the change happens. It doesn't happen in our physical perception. Because physically we perceive things the same. Art's not really about physical perception. It's about our mental imagination. Artworks objectify our imagination. They don't objectify our perception. So that's one of the gambits we'll be exploring. So again, judgment is also the realm not only of feeling, but of imagination. So in our freedom, how do we exercise our freedom? We imagine things that don't exist, and then we make them happen. I realize there's one last thing. Idealism and realism. So I mentioned empiricism. There's also the question of idealism, of traditional idealism. So in a very comic book kind of way, I'll demonstrate idealism via Plato. And it's a little bit unfair to Plato, but nonetheless it's Plato. So Plato asked the question thousands of years ago. He said, why do we have concepts, mathematical concepts, of straight lines, circles, rectilinear forms? Why do we have geometrical notions when there are no straight lines in nature, there are no circles in nature, there are no rectilinear forms in nature? So he sort of ironically said, there must be a realm in which these things exist. There must be an ethereal realm of eternal forms, but that's not the world that we inhabit. So there must be an ethereal realm of eternal forms where straight lines and circles and rectilinear forms exist. And our world that we live in, there's a noumenal realm of eternal forms, and our phenomenal world that appears to us is an imperfect projection of that ethereal realm of eternal forms. So this is where we get what Pippin last week called the traditional reality appearance distinction. Namely that appearances are deceptive, essences are true, but appearances are deceptive. So don't trust your eyes, trust your mind. Okay, so how does Kant reconfigure this idea? We have notions of straight lines, rectilinear forms, circles, etc., even though they don't exist in nature, because we want them to exist. We desire them in practice. And then we make them happen. All right, so again, the formal capacities are subjective capacities that are ultimately practically grounded. They're not being communicated to us indistinctly from some other dimension of reality. Again, when Plato posited this, he did so semi-ironically in order to allow for a space to think about forms and aesthetic appearances. It wasn't necessarily literal. And yet, of course, it was taken as literal for a very long time, about the noumenal versus the phenomenal. So Kant has a completely different view of this, that the noumenal realm doesn't exist out there somewhere, but exists as a function of our mental faculties. And not only that, the noumenal realm that the ancients thought was eternal, it's the noumenal realm that actually changes. Our ideas change. Our forms change. the physical world doesn't really change, right? We're surrounded by physical objects, by organic nature that doesn't really change in any appreciable historical way. The trees have been the trees for millions of years. What has changed is our ideas. So the phenomenal realm doesn't change so much as the noumenal realm does. So it's the exact opposite of what the ancients thought. And so again, the noumenal realm has to do with us. It doesn't have to do with some other dimension of reality. And yet these are not mere fictions either. They're not mere fictions either. Why? Because they have practical effects. Our ideas change the world. Right? Through our mathematical ideas, we've learned to change matter and energy. We've created subatomic particles that don't exist in nature, just out in the suburbs. There's the Fermi Lab, there's the National Particle Accelerator. We split the atom. We've done things with matter and energy that don't take place in nature. How have we done it? With our ideas. With our mathematical ideas. Freedom. That's freedom. So, the substance of the subject is in freedom, which is primarily practical. We actually change the world, including physical matter and energy, in a way the animals don't. The animals don't do that. Only we do that.
So I have a question.
Yep.
I know this isn't exactly the central topic here, but when I read Plato years ago, I guess I never really picked up on sort of being coy about the forms. Is it in the text, or are you getting? I've never heard that.
There's a lot of interpretation of Plato, as you might imagine, over the centuries. And so there has been this question of, does he mean it literally or not? Or, I mean, because it comes out of, isn't it, it's one of the Socratic dialogues? And then it's also in the Republic. But isn't it in the Phaedrus? I forget which one, where they're talking about, they're sitting on the river and they're like, oh.
Maybe, I don't know.
Right, anyway. So it's dialectically presented, right? And the Socratic dialectic is this kind of dialogue through which you go from error to truth, right? And so it's a kind of a moment of that, where it's sort of posited, well, we have these ideas, but we don't actually observe these things in reality. So where do we get these ideas from? So anyway, yes, this is one interpretation. I think it's a pretty solid interpretation, though. Because if we remember that Socrates said that the beginning of wisdom is what? Knowing what you don't know. Right? So the whole positing of the noumenal realm is actually a positing of what we don't and can't know. Right? So it's it's one of these funny things. And then that's turned by the Christians into divine mystery and what God wants us to know versus what God doesn't want us to know and all that good stuff, right? And Kant is not about that. Kant is not about truth that God is withholding from us. No, it's not about that. It's about what we can know and how do we know it. It's not about what we can't know, and therefore what we should take a skeptical attitude towards. Plato is about that. It's about sophistry and concepts, and maybe they're misleading, and we don't understand, and we don't know, right? Kant's actually we do know things. We do. Why? Because we act on them in practice, and we change things. And we develop. We don't just change things randomly. We don't just make a series of errors. We develop things. We build things up across history, our capacities. Right, so it's just a different kind of positing of the problem, but that's the basic reason why one might interpret Plato to be posing a question rather than providing an answer, right? Because it's in that kind of Socratic mode of like, how should we treat our own ideas? Mm-hmm.
So they can, as a result of reading Rousseau, thinks that there wasn't anything that we couldn't know.
Anything that we couldn't know? Yes, I would say in a nutshell, yes. Meaning, if what you mean is it's open-ended, meaning there's no inherent limit. There's whatever limitation we have now, but that's not an inherent limit for all time. So it's open-ended. Right, so presumably there's no limit to our knowledge. There's no limit to our practical capacities. There's no limit to our aesthetic development subjectively. One way of thinking about it, it's also a Rousseauian idea, which is we have a much more complex understanding, much more complex experience of things now than it seems that people had in the past. Meaning in the past, things seem to be simpler, more straightforward, whereas we are caught up in sort of endless complications. And Rousseau thought that that was a function of our freedom, meaning it's a blessing and a curse. It's for good or for ill, but nonetheless, it's something that we can and should take responsibility for. So that would be the sort of Kantian spirit of it, which is that whatever limits there are to our knowledge now, we can be sure that they will be transcended in the future.
I'm sorry, so kind of thinking about like the analogy of these concepts now, like I know you've kind of expressed a bit of disdain for postmoderns and such, but
Postmodernists are all about what we can't know.
well, I guess what I'm wondering is like when we look at like this lineage from like Plato to Kant with respect to like noumenal experiences, like, would you say that that's the same genealogical thread that lands later with like the Lacanian real, or more or less same problematic, right?
Yeah, I mean, it gets complicated in the 20th century, obviously. And we're going to get there, but we're going to get there kind of in a roundabout way. We'll see how we get there later. We're going to get there, again, in a complicated way. We're going to get there via Nietzsche, because Nietzsche is in the background for Heidegger. And so we'll, and also in some ways you could say that there's some affinity between Nietzsche and psychoanalysis. Perhaps, so we'll see what comes of this. But yeah, it's about what we can and do know. It's not about what we can't and don't know. Or it's about posing whatever we might desire to know as like a practical matter, right? So it's something that I think the way Pippin put it last week, the community not living up to its own ideal and suffering from that, well then where does the ideal come from? The ideal is the best we've been able to do so far. So it has a kind of a practical kind of character to it, meaning we give ourselves tasks, strivings, goals, and then of course we torment ourselves with these goals, and we task ourselves with them, we try to achieve these goals. But the idea is that, why do we give ourselves these goals? How do we give ourselves these goals? As a function of a practical overcoming of the condition that we've created for ourselves in the past. So we live in a society that was created by people in the past. We're tasked with overcoming the way things are now. That's given to us from the practical efforts of the people in the past. But in so doing, we'll create problems for people in the future. So in overcoming the problems we inherit from the past, we'll create new problems for the people in the future. And that's history. It's kind of one difficulty is that this is very optimistic. It's very optimistic. The idea is that because we've created these problems, we can solve them. That may not be true. So Heidegger, for instance, has the opposite notion, which is that actually we can create problems that we can't solve. Right, so we've created nuclear weapons. And slowly but surely more countries get nuclear weapons, and the political situation in the world is such that there is still conflict between nation states. And so it seems like, oh, we've created this thing that will destroy us. Will we solve the political problem of nation states before we blow ourselves up with nuclear weapons? No, because we've already used nuclear weapons. There already was nuclear war. The United States already nuked Japan in World War II. So nuclear war has happened, right? So maybe we've created some problem that we can't solve because politically we can't overcome the conflict of nation states, and so we have these weapons that make the conflict of nation states especially deadly. We don't even need nuclear weapons. We can kill hundreds of thousands of people without nuclear weapons, in fact, like in Ukraine. Yeah, so have we doomed ourselves? Have we created insoluble problems for ourselves? Maybe, right? That's Heidegger, that's pessimism by comparison to the optimism of Kant. Kant's like, yeah, we might suffer a lot, but eventually we'll figure it out, because we have to. So what do we believe, by the way? Do we believe that we will figure it out, we'll solve this problem, even though we might suffer a lot along the way? Because we have to, after all, we have to solve this problem, don't we? Or do we believe that we won't ever solve the problem, that we will destroy ourselves before we solve the problem? What does Elon Musk say? Elon Musk says we have to move to Mars because otherwise we will definitely blow ourselves up. If we remain a one-planet species, then we're doomed. So the only hope is to become a multi-planet species. But then he, I guess more recently, has figured out that actually we will take our problems to the other planets. It's like, oh, who would have thought that? Who would have thunk it? Right. But anyway, yeah, so the optimism and pessimism bit is important. Right? Are we pessimistic or optimistic about this? Are we going to figure this out or are we not? There's also a middle road, which is that we will destroy ourselves and survive destroying ourselves. Meaning, we will come out of the irradiated hellscape of World War III, and nonetheless we'll still be there, and so we'll still have to deal with these problems, and so meaning it probably won't be as simple as blowing the whole Earth up. That would be too easy. That would be too easy. So we might as well figure out what faculties we have that might allow us to figure it out. That might provide a solution. Not guaranteed, but could. Could. If we ever do figure it out, how will we figure it out? That we have that much freedom, that we could. We won't necessarily, but we might. All right. Let me turn to the notes that you guys posted. How are we doing for time? Do we need... Let's take 10 minutes. Or 5 minutes, really, 5 minutes. Let's just stretch our legs, bathroom break, 1 cigarette or less. Half a cigarette. We're waiting for the last couple of people to come back. Let's look at this chart that he has at the very end of the introduction, where he lays out his philosophy in a kind of curious way. So he's got the three critiques laid out here. So he's got the first critique, understanding, conformity to law, nature. He's got the second critique, the faculties of desire, reason, final purpose, freedom. And then he has judgment in between them, mediating. So he has purposiveness. And that's going to get us into one of the ways that he defines the beautiful, and that is purposiveness without purpose. Purposiveness without purpose. And we're going to see that this is also true of the teleological being, purposiveness. So why not just call it purpose? Why purposiveness? Why that kind of very contorted way of putting things? Because it's purposiveness without purpose, meaning it's open-ended. Now, one way of thinking about it, I mentioned the mechanical view of the universe, the kind of deterministic view of the universe. The idea that the universe is like this clockwork mechanism, and everything within it is a clockwork mechanism, and then God is the prime mover that sets the clockwork mechanism in motion. Well, no, it seems that it's a self-moving substance. Use a Hegel phrase, a self-moving substance that is subject. So it has purposiveness, but without purpose, the way a gear in a machine, a cog in a machine, has a purpose, has a specific, definite, determinate function. Rather, it seems that in our freedom, we change our purpose, we change our function. So the cogs in the machine can alter their function. The machine itself can be changed. So art, we will see, is not just fine art. It's not just art in the sense that capital A art, but rather art, anything that requires a judgment. So if you've ever heard the phrase, something is an art, not a science. Something is an art, not a science. What does that mean? It means that it requires the exercise of judgment. It isn't just a logical proposition. So again, it's kind of colloquial notions of science and art, because of course science isn't merely logical either. There are leaps of intuition, there are judgments made in the realm of science as well, but in the colloquial sense of these terms, science seems to be something that proceeds logically, whereas art is something that's not reducible to proceeding logically. So politics is an art, not a science. Meaning it doesn't just have a logical process, but involves judgments. And involves actually changing the logic of things. So there's an art, not a science, because it involves judgments. And so conformity to law, science in that sense, logical, that would be how we apprehend nature. Reason, giving ourselves purposes, giving ourselves final purpose or ultimate purpose in a sense, the realm of freedom. Art being somewhere in between. Why? Because art is how we alter nature in a state of freedom. And then he has this kind of weird thing that I want to just touch on. It's not the most clear passage, but it is nonetheless telling us something. So he says, well, it has been thought a doubtful point that my divisions in pure philosophy should always be threefold. But that lies in the nature of the thing. If there is to be an a priori division, it must be either analytical, according to the law of contradiction, which is always twofold, meaning something is either A or not A, or it is synthetical. And if in this latter case it is to be derived from a priori concepts, not as in mathematic from the intuition corresponding to the concept. The division must necessarily be a trichotomy. Okay, why? It says, for according to what is requisite for synthetical unity in general, there must be 1, a condition, 2, a conditioned, and 3, the concept which arises from the union of the conditioned with its condition. Okay, so the reason I'm pausing on this is that he's going to call judgment a synthetic faculty. And so it's a synthetic use of our reason. So what does that mean? It means that we're combining or achieving a unity or the union of a condition and the conditioned that can nonetheless transcend that concept which arises. Right, so I'll use a Marx phrase. Man makes history, but not under conditions of his own choosing. Man makes history, but not under conditions of his own choosing. Meaning there's always a condition that is being changed. So freewheeling. So we are conditioned, but we also transcend our condition. So in order to be able to analyze that process, he says you have to break it down threefold. And that's how he's explaining this. And so it's not merely a matter of nature and freedom, but the transformation of nature in freedom. And art illustrates that, or demonstrates it. Any art demonstrates this. So the arts, we could say more broadly, not just fine art. Okay. All right, let me turn to the notes that you guys have. Maybe, who are my volunteers? Okay, so Gia, why don't we start with yours?
Mine.
Yes.
So I had 3 main points, 1 question and 2 points that kind of involve the questions, but also just things that I found particularly intriguing in the text. The first one, that which pleases the senses and sensations, pleasant. The word pleasant, the phrase present, pleasant. What does that entail in Kant's critique of judgment, in that introductory, first chapter? I was just curious as to, as a broader word in that context, what does it entail? Oh, okay. Yeah.
What do you think? Take a stab at it.
I think that it does kind of correlate to the general forms of pleasure, but I wasn't exactly sure. I think it kind of played tricks on me.
Okay, how so? What was tricky?
Tricky in the modes of interpretation that one could use, multitude of interpretations for that particular word, and how he describes something. There's this other text that I was reading that used the word sublime, for example. I see those kinds of words, it's generally like specifics.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's talk about this in terms of taste. I mean, it's something that we're going to get into anyway, so we might as well broach it now. So, taste.
Yes.
Is subjective. Subjective. So each according to his own taste or her own taste. Right? It's a matter of taste. What I find pleasant, you might not find pleasant, and vice versa. Nonetheless, we both find things pleasant. So it's subjective, but it's also universal. It's universal. So what's universal? What we find pleasant might be different. We might have different feelings about different things.
The same way.
Yeah, we're all capable of experiencing things pleasantly, aesthetically, even if we experience different things differently,
Okay.
or we experience the same thing differently. But nonetheless, the fact of having a faculty of taste is universal. Right? So everybody has this experience, this subjective judgment of things. They judge things beautiful, not beautiful, pleasant, unpleasant. We all know what that means, even if we don't agree on how we feel about things.
My question to that is, since taste is subjective, that's an obvious. Why do people like tastemakers, for example, exist? Why do we have high art? What classifies low art, for example? Why do these tiers exist? Who determines that? And why do we even have them in the first place?
Go ahead.
Well, I think so. Like this goes back to like the way I read this sentence, that which pleases the senses and sensation is pleasant. Like
It's a tautology.
the definition is tautological. It's just saying what it says like twice. It's just saying that which is pleasant is that which pleases, and that which pleases is pleasant. So it's not like really giving anything.
Mhm.
But what it's doing is it's actually separating into two categories: the category of particular and universal.
Yep.
So like that which pleases is a particular experience. It could be whatever, I eat an apple or whatever. But he's saying anything that does that therefore rises to this higher category of the pleasant, which is a universal, a subjective universal.
That's right. So, like, adding a definite article, like the beautiful, the pleasant, generalizes it, right? As opposed to an indefinite article, like a beauty, a pleasing thing, as opposed to the beautiful, the pleasant, right? So, indeed, that's the way it kind of cashes out.
Well, I mean, I was just gonna add, I think if someone says that which pleases us is pleasant because it pleases us.
Sure, like literally very tautological, like just. Now, so he's doing this analytically. He's doing it logically, doing it analytically. And what he's trying to be clear. So he's just, saying. Now, again, then to scrutinize that more closely, why does something please us? Right? Why do we find something pleasant? And that's where, you could get into like, neurological theory. You could get into, right? But this is all like, this is the level of the animal.
Who doesn't Kant say that, like, even though it's not understood, there's like a resonance with
Yeah.
understanding? Like
Uh-huh.
when beauty makes us feel pleasure, and I won't pretend to fully understand the passages that I'm thinking about right now, but like there's like this, hesitate to use the word unconscious, sort of like resonance between something in the understanding and something that is felt with this exposure to beauty. I don't know if that's right or not.
Well, let's see. Maybe the second point helps us move along. Yeah, it actually does, it seems. Go ahead.
Okay. If the judge objects merely brings concepts and long presentation of beauty is lost. Thus, there can be no rule according to which anyone is forced to recognize anything as beautiful. Would such a notion apply to the subjectivity of beauty in the context of the environment that we reside in?
Okay,
Facts
let's.
coming in, facts coming out, things being classified, what I said previously, into different tiers. For example, thinking of like simply beauty trends come in, fade out. So in that nature, in that sense, the nature, our environment.
Okay, so for Kant, something can't be beautiful merely because it accords with our concept of the beautiful. Right? So it's not just a cultural convention. Mm-hmm.
He was saying it's not something that just pleases but gratifies. But I don't know what that means.
Agreeable.
Oh, well, that's another point. Okay, so let's stick with like gratifies or satisfies, right? Like in some way, meaning that it seems to do something, right? So our experience of the object seems to sort of fulfill a desire, like it sort of meets a want that we might not have even known that we had. And this would be, of course, the relation between practical reason and the beautiful, right?
His
Which
term
is
interest. His term is interest.
right.
Satisfies an interest or gratifies an interest.
Yes, and so the question is, what nature is of that interest is there? So again, it seems to be like the satisfaction of a practical interest or a practical desire, but also is not reducible to that, because again, we're thinking about a kind of mental satisfaction or a mental gratification that isn't like a physical or a practical gratification, but seems to be analogous to.
You kind of separate the pleasant from the beautiful, and you kind of.
Yeah.
I feel like you kind of
Yeah.
describe the pleasant as gratifying, right? It's
Yes.
gratifying as in satisfying your desires,
Uh-huh.
but the beautiful is something that should be disinterested,
Uh-huh.
meaning that it's not supposed to be bad.
That's right. So this is, of course, one of the more like triggering, like controversial aspects of Kant is the disinterested idea of beauty. Something that Schiller will address, Hegel will address, Nietzsche will address. Nietzsche will be like, no, there's no such thing as disinterested beauty. It's kind of, we get into category errors, to use a kind of philosophical concept here, which is that disinterested notion of beauty means not merely satisfaction of a practical interest or practical need or practical desire, meaning it's not reducible to that. If we keep that in mind, meaning it's not philosophically interesting to think about why something that's practically good for you or physically gratifying to you gives you pleasant feelings, right? That's pretty straightforward, right? What is hard to explain is why something that is not of any practical use or physical gratification might cause you to have the feeling of pleasure. Now, the beautiful, yes, is more than merely the pleasant, because, again, the beautiful is at a greater kind of remove from the realm of even analogies to practical interest or desire. So he starts with, feelings of pleasure and pain. Feelings of pleasure means pleasant feelings. Like I said, he's going to complicate it when we get to the sublime, because that's going to be a pain that feels good. That's different. But the beautiful is not merely the pleasant, because the pleasant still seems to be about the satisfaction of a practical or physical.
See, I thought that those were separated. I thought that the pleasant is indeed tied to beauty, and the agreeable, the gratifying, is with sense, and therefore.
Okay, so say something about the agreeable.
So I think the term the agreeable is the term he's using to talk about this sort of base satisfaction that we've been sort of suggesting, this kind of pleasure in a colloquial sense. But I think pleasure in his lexicon is the result of encountering beauty. It either induces pleasure or displeasure. It's what he keeps saying over and over again, and that's how he distinguishes it. It's not satiation or gratification, and it's not like an objective conceptual thing. It's right in the middle, or like just a kind of blank, conceptless induction of pleasure or displeasure.
All right, so let's try to be a little bit more concrete about it. So we could say, like neurology could tell us that certain colors stimulate our optic nerve and the optical processing center of our brain in certain ways. And so we get different sensations from different colors. Some people might like some colors over other colors, but generally speaking, there are some sort of common neurological kind of stimulation attributes. Kant would say that's not really the realm of the beautiful. That's the realm of the pleasant. right? So you could say, okay, like a kind of soft pastel color painted on a wall, people are going to find that pleasant. May not be particularly stimulating. Maybe like a vibrant red painted on the wall would be more stimulating, but maybe not everyone would find that pleasant. Maybe they'd be overstimulated by it, because he gets into that kind of discussion.
Did he get
right?
and sorry to go into it. I mean, this text is like a labyrinth for me. So I'm going to have a lot of stopping and questions here. But when there's actually a section, I forgot where, he's talking about color, and he actually divides it in a kind of bizarre way, like the primary colors are beautiful, but the tertiary colors are merely gratifying. Anybody else remember that?
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
He's the purity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's talking about like simplicity of truth.
Right. Right, which we might question that kind of color theory, but
I mean, I was following the way you were rendering the example.
Yeah.
He talks about it a little bit differently.
well, for instance, Kant is, we're going to see what he has to say about art is very much based on a kind of classicism kind of mode. And so immediately Romanticism, let alone modernism, will mess with what he thinks about art and artistic forms. Nonetheless, even for Kant, he would say that what makes a painting beautiful is not merely its color palette. Right? It's not like, oh, this painting's beautiful because it has these colors versus that painting that's not beautiful because it has these other colors. No. A painting can be pleasant as opposed to unpleasant based on the colors, but that would be something other than the beautiful. Right, that's what it means to say not sense, not merely agreeable to the senses. Right, so again, he's sort of building, right? He's sort of layering these concepts. So that's why he starts with like taste and, okay, when people say that they like something or don't like something, they usually mean they find it pleasant or they don't find it pleasant. Oftentimes it's about agreeability to the senses, and so he's saying that's not really what the beautiful refers to. Right, so he's sort of getting us there. Now, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Maybe like one way of sort of like, I think when he talks about pleasure in his lexicon,
Uh-huh.
I think it's more akin to like the Greek term eudaimonia, like satisfaction of like things being in the right place or something like that. Like it's
Happiness.
like an intellectual sort of pleasure.
Oh, uh-huh. Right.
And that's why I think that's why I don't fully understand the connection yet, but he's said multiple times he's gone back to this like this experience hinges on like a resonance with the understanding. But that I get a little fuzzy. I got to reread some of those sections.
Let's go back to the hierarchy of taste, maybe, Gia's point, which is to say, how can there be a hierarchy of taste? How is that possible?
Socially.
I guess socially, but how would an individual, like, say, when I was 10 years old, I was unable to appreciate classical music, but now in my 20s, I can appreciate classical music.
It's the sensation that you get from it. It's that momentary sensation, and then that can fade away, that can be exaggerated, that can be enunciated, whatever ways. I'm not exactly sure.
Part of the issue is it can't be a matter of passing mood. Right? So you can be in a bad mood and still appreciate something aesthetically.
I see.
Right? So in other words, philosophically, it's not a mystery or a puzzle why you wouldn't feel pleasant if you're in a bad mood. Right? So this goes to the issue of emotion, by the way, emotion versus feeling. So emotion is more from within, and feeling is more about the object, or at least apparently about the object. Right? So, again, the puzzle or the interesting problem is you're in a bad mood, and yet you can be struck by something as beautiful nonetheless. It isn't mood dependent. It isn't merely psychological or emotional in terms of your emotional state.
that I framed the point wrong.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I might have referred wrongly to one's emotional state. I was mostly referring to things that evoke something further than just feelings.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, exactly, right. So, but again, my example would be, you guys are all more or less educated with respect to art, various art forms. You can recall before you were so educated. In other words, you can recall a time in your life before you were able to appreciate the art that you appreciate now. Yes? Like, we understand that, like, children who haven't had a lot of exposure to art might have more difficulty, like, appreciating things, right? So that would be your hierarchy of taste right there. In other words, it would be experiential, educational. It would be about the cultivation of taste, the education of taste, the cultivation of taste. Right. So it would be that some things are more sort of demanding with respect to aesthetic judgment or capacity for experience.
Because it's on the screen.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Second point, when he talks about kind of ideals, in order to consider something good, I must always know what sort of thing the object is meant to be. I must have a determined concept. That's kind of sounds like I didn't used to like classical music, but now as a seasoned adult, I understand what classical music is supposed to be, the forms it's supposed to take, and therefore can appreciate it. Wouldn't that move sort of what you're talking about more into the realm of the good than the beautiful? Like being able to, your tastes change and you're able to appreciate now. That seems like he would say that's the realm of the good because it's adhering to an ideal form.
Yes, that would be. Go ahead, Mark.
Sorry, I had something with my tongue already in the ties of that. Like, so I think the key that, like, it's not that it's connected to the good, but it is universal. It's like the universal, the subjective universal, and then it's a priori. It can be deduced a priori, and this is where I get confused over because it also appears as like a consensus a posteriori. It's like everyone must feel the same. So I'm not really sure how.
All right. Well, let's unpack that a bit.
Yeah.
Okay. So we can technically judge something to be good if we have knowledge of its forms, of the techniques of art. But that doesn't mean that we would personally judge it to be beautiful or not. Right? We can say this is a well-executed film, but I don't particularly like it. Right? So that's where it would connect up with the good. Right? In other words, you can say, this is a good film, but I don't particularly appreciate it aesthetically. It's not according to my taste.
In my mind, that would make more sense using it
We'd have a pleasant feeling.
This film is good, but it doesn't please me. But it's still beautiful. Like, could you say that?
Yeah, I mean, we're gonna kind of mess with the way he's trying to, the way Kant's trying to layer the concepts there, because then we can use these words however we want, of course, but in other words, we could say, because he would say that the experience of the beautiful cannot be reduced to, again, keep that phrase in mind, not reducible to, a technical judgment of good execution.
So that still have some kind of emotional, like, feelings.
Yeah, it kind of leaves me cold.
If that film was also beautiful, that would be accessory beauty. Because like the film would be rooted in concept, not in beauty, and then any beauty on top of it would be embellishment, would be accessory beauty in this.
That's right. Because the interesting question philosophically is, how can a technically poor work of art still be beautiful? Because it can. How can a technically excellent work of art not be beautiful, and a technically poor work of art be beautiful? That happens. How is that possible? Well, one reason is that it's not in the object. It's in our subjective experience of it. right? So kind of objective criteria versus subjective criteria. He is concerned with the subjective criteria of the beautiful and how that works, right? That's what he's trying to explain. He's trying to explain, how does it work? How does our subjective judgment of something as beautiful, how does that actually work? Experientially, what's the process that we go through when that happens? Right, so again, go ahead.
So is it all linked to mental gratification?
Say more.
All of the senses are okay.
Say more about that. Why did that occur to you?
Because you said pleasure, pain, and taste, like most of the senses. Is it like all mental gratification?
Yeah. So again, it's the realm of the imagination. So our idea of the object is what we find beautiful. And we can have all sorts of ideas of the object. We can have a conceptual idea of the object, a theoretical understanding of the object, that kind of idea of the object. We could have a practical idea of the object. We could say, this is a very well-crafted thing. But neither of those would be an aesthetical idea of the object. So something is beautiful when the aesthetical idea of it pleases us, rather than merely the conceptual idea or the practical idea pleasing us.
Or the idea, or just the presentation?
Well, it's still our mental experience of it. In other words, that's what he means by idea, meaning our kind of the aesthetical idea of the object is not merely as it appears to us empirically, like our sense data perception. Part of what the experience of the beautiful is, for Kant, is that we see more there than is physically there. Right? Now, think about it in terms of art. So I mentioned that art is not about objectifying the senses, but about objectifying the imagination. So we have ready at hand a way of talking about this, the trompe-l'oeil in painting. In other words, the art of painting is to make people see more than is physically on the two-dimensional surface. To see lines, colors that are not physically there. To see space that is not physically there. So the art of painting is to make us see things that are not actually there physically. So where are they? In our minds. Right? So it's in our imagination that we see the lines and colors and spaces that are not physically there. Our physical senses only see what is physically there. It's our imagination that sees more there than is actually there physically. So that's the aesthetical idea. And we do have to be educated to some extent to be able to look at painting, look at sculpture, listen to music. We do. Even if it's a mere matter of exposure, cultural exposure, and then sort of learning mentally to play with these things that are put in front of us. Right? So a dog is not going to see more in a painting than is physically there. You can get a kind of basic optical illusion, but you're not going to have an imagined aesthetical idea presented. Right? You can play optical illusory tricks on animals, but can you get them to have an aesthetical idea of the object? No, you cannot. So again, the trompe-l'oeil would explain things to a certain extent. It wouldn't explain things beyond that extent, because in fact it's not just a matter of an optical illusion. It's a matter of the aesthetic form.
So all the good, pleasant, and beautiful is towards satisfaction, and satisfaction has to be like kind of fulfilling to make aesthetic idea, or is just different ideas?
Yes, right. So again, our aesthetic idea of something is what exceeds its empirical reality. Right. So again, here's another way of thinking about it. Looking at a painting is an activity. What kind of an activity is it? It's an activity in the sense that your eyes scan the image. Yes, it's a physical activity. It's a mental activity. It's a mental activity. So not the work of your eyes, but the work of your mind, the work of your imagination is what makes it what it is, according to use his language, an aesthetical idea of it.
Before you like mentally working, you actually like feel it.
Well, your reason that you're going to feel a good feeling, have a pleasant feeling, is because of the way it's gratifying or satisfying your imagination. Meaning, it's fulfilling your aesthetical idea of it more than just merely your physical sensation of it. That would be the difference.
So, if Kant argues for an objective beauty, then wouldn't all art that is objectively beautiful be coincidental? Because if beauty is objective, then however somebody determines beauty in their head is inherently subjective. So however they express that onto a painting will be their subjective rendition. Therefore, any art that is objectively beautiful is not intended to be that way. Like it would be impossible.
Right. So, the question of objective and subjective is tricky because, on the one hand, we're talking about just subjective things. We are. However, he also says that we experience it as objective. Okay. So, though things are subjective, they're not merely subjective. So really what we're dealing with is what's known as the dialectic of subject and object, meaning we think and we feel that it's about something more than our solipsistic experience of things. We do think that it's about the object. We experience it as prompted by the object, as being about the object. The object is more than our sense data perception is presenting to us. We do think that. And we're going to see that he's sort of going to move in this way. So when we're struck by something as beautiful, we're struck by it as an object. However, object is different from thing. So object is something that exists with relation to the subject. So it's the subject, in a sense, seeing in the thing more than is there. So making of the thing more than is merely there. But we are nonetheless, experientially, our experience of it is that the object is beautiful. The object is more than it appears to be.
Qua phenomenon.
Yes, right. So that's the question. The question is, how and why does that happen? How and why would we see more than is there? And that's why it can't just be a purely mental exercise. It has to be in relation to something. So there's an object. And yet the object is connected to the subject. So the way he describes it, he's got different ways of describing it. So the practical purpose, let's get at that. So like a flower, he uses natural objects. So a flower is what? It's a sexual organ of a plant. A biologist is going to see a flower as a functional part of an organism. It serves a biological function. It's a bit of engineering. So it functions to pollinate seeds, maybe attract insects to facilitate that process. It works a certain way. It has certain colors, it has certain shapes, it functions. That's not going to tell us whether a flower is beautiful or not. That's going to tell us whether a flower is functional or not for its purpose as a physical part of a biological organism. when we regard the beauty of the flower, we're not thinking of it functionally. We're thinking of it as if it were an aesthetic form in itself. It isn't, right? The aesthetic form that it has, the physical structure it has, and therefore what we're seeing is completely derived from its biological function. And yet, we don't look at it that way. We look at it as if it were meant to produce a pleasant sensation in us. We look at it as if it exists as an aesthetical object rather than as a functional object. And that's because we have this aesthetical idea that the flower seems to confirm that really has nothing to do with why it actually exists and how it's formed. Right? So you see subject and object, there's a functional object, there's an aesthetic object. And then you could even say there's some kind of conceptual, there's some kind of conceptual, I'm forgetting my botany and my plant anatomy, but there are things that are like flowers that are not really flowers, right? If you know this kind of language, right? So they sort of function as part of the biological reproduction cycle of the plant, but they're not really flowers, right? So there are these sort of analytic distinctions, these kind of conceptual distinctions that one might make, that are related to functional distinctions, but nonetheless, right? So, but we're not thinking that way. We're thinking at the level of aesthetic form. Why do we find a flower beautiful? We don't find a flower beautiful because of its practical functionality. Right? We're not just saying it's elegant in its function. It's a nice bit of engineering. It functions well. We're not thinking about that at all when we're thinking whether a flower is beautiful or not. So it's both the object and the subject involved. He says, you're walking through the woods, and suddenly there's a flower, and you're struck by its beauty. It's as if it exists just to present itself to you as a beautiful object. Of course, that's not why it exists. But nonetheless, that's how we experience it. So when we're struck by the beauty of nature, it's as if it's presenting itself to us in order to satisfy our aesthetical ideal. Of course, in reality, that's not the case, but that's the way we experience it. Now, this is going to be important because when it gets to teleological beings in 2 weeks, we're going to talk about nature and why we think nature is created by God. Right? So do you know creationism? Intelligent design? No, have you heard of intelligent design? Like, the universe is so well designed, it had to have been created by someone. It can't possibly have just happened spontaneously through natural evolution. That makes no sense. Right? Because everything is so perfectly designed. God must have made it that way. Well, what Kant is going to say is that's a subjective illusion. In other words, we're bound to experience the world as if it were designed, even though it isn't. But that has more to do with the way our subjectivity functions than it has to do with the way nature exists. Right? In other words, we're bound to believe that the world was created by a divine force because it just seems so perfectly the way it is. But that's just our subjective experience of it, in fact. It's not that it has nothing to do with the way things are, but it also is not really the case that this is evidence for God. It's not evidence for God. What it is evidence for is our subjective faculty of finding things purposeful in nature. Right, so, again, because he'll say maybe God exists, maybe God doesn't exist, and that's a matter of faith alone, not reason. We're not going to be able to prove it to ourselves. Conceptually, practically, aesthetically, like we might try to, but in the end, it's just going to be a matter of faith. But meanwhile, why do people experience things as divinely created and purposeful and ordered, like the physical universe seems to have an order to it? right? Well, that has more to do with the way we experience things, our subjective faculties, than it has to do with the way things are in themselves. Mm-hmm.
And like with that, I think to the question of like objective beauty, I mean, as I'm reading the text, it's like it seems like there's a distinction that's really easy to get tripped up on,
Mm-hmm.
and that's the distinction between objective and universal.
Mm-hmm.
Because I don't think that anywhere in the text he's saying that like beauty is objective. He's saying that it's universal.
That's different,
It's
yeah.
subjective, but it's universal because it requires that everyone feel the same way about it. So like universality and objectivity are like different.
Well, what's universal is this faculty. Right? In other words, all cultures, all peoples, and all communities at all times and in all places have demonstrated this faculty. Namely, the ability to aesthetically appreciate things that are of no practical benefit.
Can we consider also beautiful, also something authoritarian, I don't know, because if the beautiful has immediate wandering, involve immediate stuff like pleasure, give also feeling that it's a little bit authoritarian.
Are you saying authority?
Yeah.
So, yes, so there's another point. So we don't experience things as beautiful just because we're told that they are, he thinks. Right? So we can experience things according to a concept of the beautiful because we've been told, that's beautiful, you should find it pleasant. And all that will do is be a kind of, what I mentioned earlier, a kind of pattern matching exercise, which is you've been told this is beautiful and therefore it matches your concept of it and you're going to get the pleasure of matching that concept, but that's going to be a pleasure only of the understanding, not of the aesthetic. Right? Because it's not that the aesthetic form is really pleasing you, what's pleasing you rather is your kind of conceptual understanding. Right? So again, that's where like a cultural standard of beauty is not what he's talking about. Right? A cultural standard of beauty will just tell you what you're supposed to find beautiful, and that's just going to be a matter of your understanding.
But then what people tell you is supposed to be beautiful directs your attention towards it in a way that does make it more possible for you to have this experience with it, right? Like,
sure.
If you're never told, like I don't know, like let's say like dimples are considered really attractive at some point. Like, if they're not, then you see that and it just might not even register as anything worth intaking. But if someone tells you it's beautiful, it's not that you find it beautiful because you're told, but you're being directed to spend mental faculty on aesthetically appreciating it, and it can actually be great. This kind of goes to what you were saying with like taste making, where it's not that taste making is just this thing where people tell you what's beautiful. It actually does inform what people think is beautiful, but it's not due to knowing that it's matching what it's supposed to, but rather that because attention is drawn to this as like a thing that is to be strived towards, whenever you see something that seems to be striving towards it, then all of a sudden you're actually spending mental effort into like picking up things that might give you an aesthetic experience.
Okay, so part of what's going on here, again, the philosophical problem he's trying to address, and this really gets to a basic point, which is how is it possible for us to have a pleasant feeling about something that we've never seen before? So something new and different. So not something that we've already been exposed to, not something that's cultural in that sense. Right? So yes, when we're accustomed to things, when we're surrounded by certain forms, then we might get a certain satisfaction about continuing to experience those forms that we're accustomed to. But that's not an experience of the beautiful. Now, the beautiful can become that, can become a mere cultural conventional form that satisfies us in the sense of familiarity. Again, it would be that kind of pattern matching function. The question is, in other words, why this is a philosophical question at all, is why would we ever experience something new and different that we've never seen before as pleasant? What makes that possible? Meaning, if we don't have a concept for it, if we don't already have an understanding of it, why isn't it just nonsense? In other words, why isn't it just something that doesn't compute? In which case it would cause us pain. Right? So something unfamiliar should be something that we reject because it doesn't fit our prior experience. And yet, it is possible for us to find things that we've never seen before pleasurable.
Is it because you get bored of what's familiar?
That's possible too. The question of boredom and stimulation, I mean, he's got a funny way of talking about this. So, in terms of pleasure, it's like stimulation, it's almost like this happy medium idea that like things have to be stimulating but not too stimulating and not like understimulating and not too monotonous in their stimulation, right? Now, he does all of that really to kind of clear away all the ways that we might explain this, but that still won't actually be able to explain it. And that has something to do with, by the way, the charming. Mark, you brought up the charming in your notes.
Yeah.
The charming, and it gets to the issue of the object, right? So we can find something charming in the sense of what he calls the free play of the faculties, meaning we can look up at clouds in the sky and project what we see into the clouds, right? Or we can watch ripples on the water, or we can watch flames in a fire. And it can be sort of stimulating, and we can kind of let our imagination loose and see all sorts of things in it, but there's no object. So what the issue of the object is, like why he says beauty is about beautiful objects, is because he wants to really talk about the aesthetical idea. Meaning, there is no aesthetical idea to ripples on water, or clouds in the sky, or flames in a fire. So, it's about the object in the sense of the kind of coherence, the integral existence of the thing. So I use the example of the flower. So a flower, if we cut a flower off a plant and then we put it in a vase and we're like, oh, it's a beautiful flower. It's a mutilated body part of a plant, right? We've destroyed the integral biological object. We've plucked the flower from the plant. And yet, we see the flower as if it were the object because of our aesthetical idea that it corresponds to. Right? So,
What does like aesthetical idea? And I really struggle understanding like the way the words are formed in such like weird ways. Like why aesthetical instead of aesthetic?
So aesthetical would just mean of the aesthetic, right? Like that would be it would be a kind of propositional form, and some of what we're dealing with is German translation and compound words, where you can have adjectival phrases just be a mashup of words, right? So an idea that is a kind of or about the aesthetic, right? So the aesthetical idea means that it's an idea that employs the aesthetic in its ideational kind of content or function. So we have to think that the thing is an object. Right, so a cut flower off a plant is a thing. It's a dismembered body part. What makes it an object, it's not, it conforms to a kind of conceptual object, a flower. A practical object, like I said, it's a kind of sexual body part of a plant. So it works this way. We can look at it that way, in terms of what makes it a thing at all. What makes it one thing as opposed to several things. When we're treating it as an aesthetical object, it's not according to a conceptual idea or a practical idea, but an aesthetical idea. So the aesthetical idea is that the form is somehow pleasing. but the form itself is pleasing. Not our concept or our concept of its function practically, but the form itself is pleasing in itself.
Well, so to my comment, like I guess what interests me about that is like the kind of like the line of division
Between form and formless.
Form and its embellishing charms. Because I think at one point in the text, I think he talks about like the colors of a leaf or something as constituting mere charms. But to me, like that's part of the form, right? Like leaves of a plant are part of its form.
One of you, who put the frame of the painting? You did. You put the frame of the painting, right? Frame of the painting is an interesting thing, right? So in other words, why, before modernism, paintings had frames. They always had frames. They had to have frames. So why? The frames, because the frames are embellished. The frames are like a thing, right? The frames have design. The frames have qualities. The frames have aesthetic, pleasing attributes. It's almost like a palate cleanser or something, meaning if you know what a palate cleanser is, if you go to like a culinary tasting thing, right? So you're tasting this thing and that thing, but then you don't want to just go directly from one thing to another thing. You have a palate cleanser in between, right? Like some, lime sorbet or something,
You're saying the frame is the palate cleanser?
Yeah. In other words, it's a thing that sort of isolates the work, but also sort of like, it sort of dispenses with this kind of function of, in other words, you're kind of going down the gallery and you're looking at paintings, and all the paintings have more or less ornate frames on them. And it's like the ornate frames just expend that kind of like charming appearance and allow you to concentrate on the painting. Yeah.
I think so to read it as a palette cleanser implies a kind of continuity between one painting to the next, like entrees at a restaurant, there's a sequence. I guess maybe when I think about it, because frames are falling out of popularity, right? So they're
right.
An older thing, and I think to me I register them as having to do with this separation of idealism from the real. It's a hard window, clearly. Yeah,
it's a clearly defined object. It helps define the painting.
Today we play with that now, right?
Yeah, you can play with it.
The paint is here in the room with us, kind of thing.
You can have this Seurat painting that has the complementary colors in the edge of the painting, as if it's a virtual frame within the painting, but still there's no actual frame. There's just this kind of virtual frame, and it's what the hell is that, right? But it is it's a kind of a neutral realm that helps define the object as an aesthetical object. That's what I meant by palette cleanser. Or I meant that it's a kind of a neutralization function that allows you to sort of specify, okay, this is the painting. In the same way that sculptures being on pedestals, right? So what's the function of the pedestal for the sculpture is to sort of delineate this is where the sculpture begins. But then with the modernists, you get this stuff where it's kind of is this pedestal part of the sculpture? I was looking at some Brancusi things over at the modern gallery and the modern wing. So, but we would say that the pedestal can be more or less pleasing, it can be more or less charming, it can sort of do these things, but we don't really ascribe an aesthetical ideal to it in the sense of a form in itself. The way the work is meant to be a coherent form. And that's really the issue. Because Kant, there's a reason why Kant is using nature and not art, actually. He's using nature. Because he's saying when we aesthetically isolate the object of nature, we are seeing it in terms of an aesthetical idea of it, rather than all the other ways that we might consider it. So we're defining the object aesthetically. We're not defining it practically or conceptually. We're defining it aesthetically, And what does that mean? It means that somehow it forms a whole. It has a kind of entirety to itself. It also seems to have an autonomy. In other words, it seems to be independent. And again, the flower is not independent. Flowers don't exist apart from plants. And yet, when we consider the flower, we consider it as if it were an independent object. How is it independent? Aesthetically.
I feel like it's impossible to separate the aesthetic quality of an object from its design or purpose, because especially in nature, nothing happens for no reason. Like natural selection would mean that everything that happens to an organism is because it was the best fit choice or the best fit trait for that organism to have. So even if the aesthetic of a flower isn't entirely detrimental or supportive of its design as a sexual organ, the color of the flower is still a part of the evolution of it. So you can't really say that the aesthetic of the flower is separate from its design, because the flower is a certain color because that is what allowed it to continue to reproduce.
All right, so here's the twist. Are you ready for the twist? The flowers that we have are not just the products of natural selection.
Well, yeah, because
they're the products of human breeding for thousands of years. And of course he knows that. So then the question is, why did we breed the flowers to have these forms as opposed to those forms?
So the aesthetic of the flower now is not merely aesthetic beauty to insects, but also to humans.
That's
because
right.
Now humans.
And in fact, we've bred flowers that no longer function well as sexual organs, so that the only way the plants can be reproduced is through bulb transfers and grafting, right? They no longer work as sexual organs because we've prioritized their aesthetic beauty over their biological function.
So those are no longer beautiful?
No, they are beautiful.
Well, they don't have a smell.
Huh?
They don't have a smell.
Well, we also have bred flowers for scents too, and for absence of scents. Meaning we don't really awesome, visually beautiful flowers that have a god awful stink. So we try to breed that out, right? So we've done these things, right? We've affected nature. However, we still treat it as if it's a spontaneous appearance of nature, right? In other words, when we find a flower beautiful, we're not thinking, oh, the botanists, the breeders of these flowers are really good engineers. In the same way that when we look at a work of art, we're not just saying, oh, that artist is technically good. The work itself strikes us as beautiful. Mm-hmm.
So, I have more of a question about how we consider this course. At this point in the class, we've gotten to understand Kant a bit more, but how do we grapple with maybe feeling like we just don't get what they're saying versus just disagreeing?
Oh, sure.
And
well,
we
we might
as a
disagree.
course question.
Right. We might disagree. So what I'm going to concentrate on in class pedagogically is getting us to understand the argument and the point. And then we can find it useful, not useful. We can find it revealing in certain respects or maybe concealing in other respects. Depends on what our purposes is in reading it. But when we're thinking about this, it's not about we could analyze beauty differently than Kant. The question is, why does he analyze it this way? What is he trying to get at? What is it about the beautiful that he's emphasizing, that he's trying to draw out? And what's the point of that? And actually, this issue of the independence of the object or the apparent independence of the object is very important. It's crucially important. A beautiful object for Kant is beautiful because it appears to be self-determined at the level of aesthetic form. Meaning, the flower appears to have been the spontaneous creation of the aesthetical idea of the flower as opposed to being an outgrowth of a plant. right? That when we experience something as beautiful, it's as if it only exists to have that aesthetic appearance. It has no other reality, or any other reality is subordinate to that reality. So when we experience something as beautiful, it's as if it only exists to appear as the aesthetic form that it appears as to us.
I feel like I get like the purposiveness without purpose and the experience of beauty, but I would love it if you could, as granularly as possible, describe the free play of faculties and how that constitutes the experience of beauty, like hopefully with reference to like the flower.
Right. So the free play of the faculties would be that when we experience something as beautiful, then we try to explain it to ourselves. Right? In other words, we kind of reflect on our experience. We have this apperceptive moment where we perceive our own perception. And then we kind of run through, like, okay, what is this? Why does it seem beautiful? And we try to explain it to ourselves. And so we run through our concepts of things, our practical knowledge and intuition of things, our past experience of things, what we've been told about things. We run through all those things. And we land, however, so it resolves at the level of an aesthetical idea. So that's what he thinks distinguishes the experience of the beautiful from other kinds of experience. So our experience of the understanding, our exercise of the understanding, our experience of our exercise of reason seems distinct from our experience of the beautiful or our aesthetic judgment of things. So the free play of the faculties means that we don't feel bound. Like he treats the understanding and even practical reason as much more determinate than aesthetical judgment. So that's like the free play of the faculties. The play of the faculties is that we're actually running through all these different apprehensions of the object, right? Because we're always doing all these things at once, right? They only are distinct analytically. Experientially, they're not really distinct. So that it resolves around the aesthetical idea is what distinguishes the beautiful, meaning all of our pleasant experiences of the world are not experiences of the beautiful. They're not. They might be the experience of truth or the experience of the good. Those also cause us pleasant feelings. So he's trying to analytically distinguish what characterizes our experience of the beautiful. And again, how it's possible, meaning, is there something that we're experiencing that is not reducible to our successful exercise of our faculty of understanding or practical reason? Right? Is there something distinct that is not explicable any other way? In which case, then we're talking about the aesthetical form, and the aesthetical form in a particular way, meaning it seems like the object has given itself its own form. Right, so it's not a function of something else. It's not a purpose. It's not fulfilling something else's purpose. It's fulfilling its own purpose, but in this aesthetical way. Meaning we're not just talking about it's worked evolutionarily for the species to perpetuate itself. Right? We're not talking about that kind of practical function of the perpetuation of a form of life. We're talking about this thing seems to justify its existence on an aesthetical basis. Now, in that way, it appears more indeterminate or autonomous, meaning not heteronymous. So heteronymous would mean ruled by another, right? So a plant having a sexual organ for its biological reproduction would mean that the flower is heteronymous in character. It is ruled by another, namely the plant. The flower is not autonomous. when we look at it aesthetically as an object of beauty, then we are treating it as if it were autonomous. It's not, but we experience it as if it is. Autonomous in what way? Autonomous in its aesthetic form. Meaning it seems to make sense aesthetically.
Autonomous from logic and practicality, would you say?
Yeah. And in that way, free.
Yeah, so the free play means like using the cognitive faculties, but without the sort of like sovereignty of like the understanding or reason. Like concepts can be wherever they land in a sense, whereas with the understanding they have to land with, concepts. When practicality they have to land with morality. Here they can land anywhere.
Specifically, that one thing might be seen beautiful and the other not. I think for Kant would say for one there's a harmony between imagination and the understanding, and there isn't
Yes.
harmonizing. Could you talk about that? And could you talk about in reference to the flower? Because that's the only way.
Because the beautiful is an experience that's not reducible to our conceptual or practical reason, it might challenge our concepts and it might challenge our practical understanding of things. So as a synthetic faculty, the faculty of judgment would challenge our notion of what makes sense in other ways. It might cause us to, because again, he's concerned with how would we alter our theories? How would we alter our understanding? How would we alter our concepts? How would we alter our practical way of doing things? How is that possible? So he does think that when someone, we're going to get into this next week, invents a new way of doing things that doesn't correspond to past practice, or not reducible to past practice, that's going to be a function of an aesthetical imagination of the way things could be done. Right, so, and why would we do that? For the sake of finding a new way of doing things, for its own sake. Right? Why don't? Because again, philosophically, there is no mystery to why we would do things practically the same way for thousands of years. What works, works, and we just continue to do it because it works. In the same way that natural selection. Animals function the way they do because it's worked in the past, and so it will work. The question is, why do we come up with new ways of doing things? And also, how do we come up with new ways of doing things? We have to exercise our imagination. How do we exercise our imagination? Usually according to an aesthetical idea. And, because the imaginary object is pleasant. Okay, we're not usually guided by an imagination of unpleasant. At the level of aesthetic form. So we have to keep it, kind of... the way he's defining beauty has to do with the fact that an object is beautiful. Not all things that are pleasant are beautiful in this way. All right, so next time we'll be talking about sublime forces, meaning we experience things that are less objects than they are forces. We experience them as pleasant, but we wouldn't call them beautiful. We would rather call them sublime. All right, so again, these terms, he's inheriting these terms from the past. He's not inventing these terms entirely, but he is using them analytically in perhaps a new way. And that gets us back to the question of agreeing or disagreeing. Meaning, the question is, maybe we would disagree with the way Kant's using these words and using these terms, but then probably it would be because we want to address something else. We want to sort of address things differently. We want to sort of grasp things differently. Right. So what we have to kind of struggle with is, why does he want to address it this way? And like I said, the beautiful is our first determination of what he's going to call the teleological being, meaning the being that gives itself its own purpose. And ultimately, all life has this character of a teleological being. Like anything that we consider to be living has this character to it. The first determination of that is everything that's living has, at some level, the character of a beautiful object. We'll see, that's not as sufficient. It's not as sufficient. It's a necessary but not sufficient definition of a teleological being, but it's a necessary aspect. Right, that what we're struck by when we're struck by something as beautiful, when we're struck by a beautiful object as beautiful, it's striking us as autonomous. And the reason that we find that pleasant, he says, is because it seems to confirm our own autonomy. In other words, it seems to be autonomous the way we feel ourselves to be autonomous. And not only that, it seems to be self-determining, it seems to be free in the way that we experience ourselves as free. Right, so in the beautiful, there's a sympathetic resonance of subject and object, where we experience the object as giving itself its own purpose in the way that we experience ourselves giving ourselves our own purpose. And the way it's being conveyed to us, that autonomy, that self-determination, is through its aesthetical form.
Is that its purposiveness?
Purposiveness, yes. Purposiveness, absolutely. Right, so, like I said, teleological, something being an end in itself. Something existing for its own sake. So when something strikes us as beautiful, it seems to exist for its own sake in the way that we experience ourselves as existing for our own sake. All right. I'll see you guys next week.